Easter opens in an in-between time between darkness and between light. The darkness has not yet left, and the light has not yet arrived. We hear this morning's gospel in this in-between time, and we hear it in verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. And so then she goes back to the disciples. She doesn't know what has happened. And Peter and John hear her story that the tomb is empty, and thinking that it has been raided, the body has been taken, another injustice towards their Lord, they race back to the tomb. Peter and John enter. They see the empty tomb. They see the burial cloths. And we're offered a conflicting verse. They believe, yet they don't fully understand what is in store. They don't fully grasp this message. You ever have a situation where you get a sense that you have an understanding of something new, but you can't quite grasp it? That seems to be what's going on for Mary. And then we hear these words. Peter and John have gone home, but Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. She's confused. She's scared. She's in pain that her Lord's body has been taken. She doesn't know what to do. Do you remember the last time you felt lost? Remember the last time you felt scared? The last time you didn't know where to turn? That is what is going on with Mary. Anybody here ever been a patient in the hospital? Yeah? You remember what it's like at 3 a.m. when you're on that ward and everything is really quiet? 11 years ago, I had surgery, and I was supposed to be out in 2 or 3 days, and 5 days later, I'm still there. And I have a lot of discomfort, and I start wondering at 3 a.m. if I will ever get out of there. I feel lost. I feel scared. And I have my IV pole, and I have my Johnny. Don't know why they call it a Johnny. Don't know whether you're tied in the front or the back. There's no way to be dignified when you're wearing a Johnny. Amen? So there it is, 3 a.m, have my IV pole, have my Johnny tied in the back, and I'm making a circle around the nurse's station. Because when I lie down, I don't feel good, and so I am just walking, waiting for some relief, waiting for sleep to come. I go up and down that hallway again and again, feeling frightened and feeling lost. We pick up the story. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and she wept. She bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at his head and the other at his feet. Now, the word angel means a messenger. And it's not like a Hallmark card with tinsel and with the big wings. These are 2 messengers that have come to Mary. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And when she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. The risen Christ was in her very midst, but she didn't recognize him. She couldn't see him for who he was. She couldn't see the hope and the promise that was right in front of her. So Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" And so Mary thinks it's the gardener, and she begins to explain, "If you've taken my Lord's body, tell me where you have taken him." And then in verse 16, Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. Mary. In that in-between moment, between light and dark, in the midst of her confusion, in the midst of her fright, when she hears her name, everything changes. The confusion melts away, the fear melts away, and she realizes that the risen Christ is in her very midst. Imagine. I lived for 20 years on the West Coast, but I grew up in God's country, which we know as Rhode Island. And so, 2 or 3 times a year, the boys that I grew up with, would play a game. And it was always the same. The phone would ring, and they were maybe watching the Stanley Cup, or maybe they had just come in from skiing, and it was always the same. Kent, how are you? They would never say who it is. And then they would pass the phone to the other 5 or 6 guys, and they would say, Kent, how are you? And the game was, I was to guess who they were, just by the sound of their voice. 20 years on the West Coast. But these were the guys that I grew up with. And I also had to remember their nickname by the tone of their voice. Larry the Lip, how are you? Lasso Bob, how are you? Clyde, we never came up with a nickname. Clyde, how are you? Frank and Dave and Tommy. Something special about recognizing a voice, isn't it? Someone calls you, and you hear that voice, that familiar voice, and you know you belong. I think that's what happened for Mary on that first Easter. She heard her Lord's voice, and she knew it wasn't the gardener. She knew, as improbable, seemingly impossible as it may seem, that the risen Christ was in her very midst. So, I'm making the loop around the nurse's station. Johnny tied in the back, holding my IV pole, wondering if I will get out of there after 5 days in the hospital, supposed to be released in 2 or 3. I was scared. About 4:30 in the morning, in that in-between time between darkness and light, I'm going around that nurse's station for the upteenth time, and there's a woman in the hallway, 4:30 in the morning, wearing a black cocktail dress with sequins. She's got raven black hair. She's got a red scarf around her shoulders. And she's leaning against the doorway. She may have been a wife. She may have been a daughter with a late night visit. And I'm walking past, and she looks at me, and she says, "My friend, you're going to be all right." So I go back around the nurse's station, and I wonder, who is she? And the way she spoke to me, it's as if she knew me. And so I go back around the nurse's station. I come back a few moments later, and she's gone. I asked the nurse, "Did you see the woman with a black dress with the sequins?" And she said, "No." She said, "I've been working on my charts. I didn't see her." Now, I don't want to make more of this story than it is. But I also don't want to make less of this story than it is. Because I felt when I heard her voice speaking to me, "Friend, you're going to be all right," I knew that she was right. I knew suddenly that I was going to feel better and that I would go home and back to my family. Do we believe that messengers still come to us from God? Do we believe that the risen Christ is in our midst, sometimes in the most surprising of forms? I went to a retreat at Notre Dame Conference Center in Ipswich last Saturday, and there was an old priest there named Father Bill Sheehan. And he says, we spend a lot of our time living in the past, regrets, hurts, wounds, what-ifs. Or we spend our time living in the future, dreaming and scheming about what the future will hold. But he said, God speaks to us in the moment. And our call as people of faith is to be open to the ways in which God is speaking to us in the most surprising of ways, blessing us, comforting us in the midst of our worries and pain and anxiety, with us in our joys and our triumphs. And do we believe that to be true? 2,000 years ago on Easter morning, Mary's life was changed because she heard her name. She knew that she belonged to the beloved community. And do we believe that the Christ still speaks our name? Jack, Wally, Lisa, Emily. The promise of faith is that what happened 2,000 years ago was not a one-time event. The risen Christ loves us, cherishes us, and calls us by name. The work of Easter isn't over. This is the good news. Thanks be to God. And may God's people say, amen.